Jason Statham steps into a quiet park and ends up exposing a racist cop in the most unexpected way. Watch the jaw-dropping encounter that's changing hearts, shaking the system, and inspiring millions. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment. This is one story you won't forget. The late afternoon sun spilled a warm golden light across the city park, where children's laughter bounced off the trees and the rhythmic creak of joggers' sneakers on the trail blended with birdsong overhead. Spring had settled over the city like a sigh of relief, coating the branches in budding green and the air in soft breezes. Near a quiet corner of the park, beneath an old oak tree whose bark was worn and gnarled with age, sat an elderly black man named Elijah, dressed in a neatly pressed navy blue sweater and khaki pants. His posture was straight, his demeanor dignified. His skin was dark and lined with years, and his white beard trimmed with precision. A weathered leather-bound book rested in his lap, half open, though he hadn't turned a page in the last 10 minutes. He watched the world move around him with a kind of quiet, practiced patience, the way someone does when they've seen both its beauty and its ugliness and learned to sit with both. Elijah was a retired school principal, a man who had dedicated over 40 years of his life to mentoring children, educating young minds, and tirelessly advocating for those whom society had too often overlooked. He came to the park every Thursday around this time, sitting on the same bench by the oak, soaking in the calm like one might sip tea. The routine brought him peace. But on this particular Thursday, something unexpected shattered the calm like a stone through glass. It started with a patrol car pulling up too fast along the curb, tires screeching just slightly as it jerked to a halt beside the grass. A moment later, the car door slammed and out stepped a young white officer, tall and broad-shouldered, with mirrored sunglasses perched on his nose and a chip on his shoulder the size of small country. His name was Officer Bradley Voss, a man whose reputation in the neighborhood was as chilling as it was well known. Elijah had heard about him, about his quick temper, his tendency to escalate harmless situations, and his deeply embedded prejudices that everyone whispered about but few dared to confront directly. Voss approached the bench with long, arrogant strides, one hand resting on his hip near his holstered weapon, the other curled into a fist like he was already preparing for a confrontation that hadn't even started. "Hey!" he barked, loud enough to draw the attention of several passers-by. "What are you doing here?" Elijah looked up slowly, the expression on his face unreadable. "Just reading," he said, gesturing gently to the book in his lap. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that had once commanded classrooms and cooled tempers. Voss sneered. "You got ID?" "I beg your pardon?" I said. "Do you have identification?" Voss repeated, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the gravel path. "This park's had complaints about loitering. I need to see your ID. Now." "I come here every week," Elijah said, still composed. "I'm not loitering, just enjoying the weather." Voss scoffed. "You think just because you're dressed nice and got a book in your lap that makes you different? You think I don't know what's going on here?" Several people had stopped now, drawn by the volume and the tone of the officer's voice. A young mother pulled her daughter closer. A jogger slowed to a walk, glancing over his shoulder. Elijah remained seated, the book still resting on his lap, though now his fingers had curled around its spine more tightly. "Sir," he said, his voice low and steady, "I've broken no laws. There's no reason for this aggression. I'll decide what's reasonable," Voss snapped. He leaned down, just inches from Elijah's face now. "You people always act like you're above it all, like the rules don't apply to you. Well, I got news for you. They do, and you're going to show me ID or you're coming with me." The scene had taken on an uncomfortable energy. No one dared step in, but the discomfort was palpable. One teenager pulled out a phone, aiming it discreetly toward the interaction. Elijah slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, but his hand was trembling slightly, not out of fear, but from the weight of the moment, from the echo of 1,000 similar encounters he'd endured in his long life. Voss snatched the ID from his hand and looked it over with exaggerated scrutiny. "Elijah Owens," he read aloud, as if the name itself was suspicious. "Retired principal, huh? That's right. Voss made a show of inspecting the ID for longer than necessary, then tossed it back with a flick of his wrist that sent it fluttering to the ground. "Get out of here," he said. "You're not welcome." Elijah didn't move. His ID lay on the grass. The crowd watched in stunned silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to pause, suspended between breath and backlash. And then, "I don't think that's how it works, mate." The voice was British, low and gravelly, cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. All heads turned to see a man in a dark hoodie, hands in his pockets, casually walking up the path like he had all the time in the world. Jason Statham, the actor, the former competitive diver, the action star who made villains sweat and audiences cheer. But here, in this moment, he wasn't a celebrity. He was just a man who had seen enough. Voss turned around sharply. "Who the hell are you?" Jason didn't answer right away. He walked past Voss and over to Elijah, stooping down to pick up the ID with deliberate care before handing it back to its owner with quiet respect. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Owens," he said. "You dropped this." "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice still calm, but something in his eyes had shifted, a flicker of surprised gratitude breaking through the storm. Jason turned back to Voss then, standing just a foot away from the officer now. "You want to run that by me again? Not welcome? Last I checked, this is a public park. He's got every right to sit here and read a book." Voss squared his shoulders. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Jason said, his tone steely. "I don't like bullies, and I really don't like racists hiding behind a badge." That did it. The crowd, previously quiet, stirred audibly. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered woe. The young man with the phone was recording openly now. Voss's face turned red, but it wasn't just anger. It was the sudden awareness that the narrative was slipping out of his control. "You'd better walk away," Voss hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Before you regret it." Jason tilted his head, that signature Statham smirk dancing across his lips. "You know what I regret? I regret not getting here 5 minutes earlier. Might have saved you from embarrassing yourself." It was subtle, but Elijah's shoulders had straightened. The humiliation was still there, but now it had a counterbalance. A stranger had stepped in, not with violence, but with dignity. Not with fists, but with truth. The park was silent again, though not with fear this time. With anticipation, because something in the air had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The next words, the next action, would define everything that came after. And as Voss opened his mouth again, ready to hurl another insult, another threat, another excuse to justify his behavior, Jason raised a hand. Not in warning, not in threat, but in something unexpected. And that's exactly where the story starts to twist in ways no one in that park could have imagined. Jason raised his hand not to strike or even to warn, but as if asking the world itself to pause. The gesture was calm, composed, almost meditative. It wasn't a show of dominance. It was restraint, control, an echo of something deeper. The moment held, suspended in that rare space where someone with true strength chooses not to use it to harm, but to heal. Officer Voss hesitated. His mouth, once curled in authority, now looked thin, uncertain. The fire in his stance was flickering, challenged not by brute force, but by something infinitely more dangerous to arrogance. Truth, spoken fearlessly. "You ever wonder," Jason said softly, never breaking eye contact, "why people record these kinds of moments? Why your badge isn't enough to command respect anymore? It's because power used without wisdom isn't power at all. It's poison." The officer shifted his weight. This man was loitering. "He was reading a book," Jason said. "And you turned that into a confrontation. Why? Because he's old? Because he's black? Because it made you feel big?" Jason stepped closer now, not with aggression, but with the undeniable gravity of someone who had been through hell and come out the other side tempered, not broken. "I've seen men like you before, Voss. Flashy on the outside, loud, always barking orders. But inside, there's always fear. You're afraid of what you don't understand. You're afraid of losing control." Voss opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. It was as though the script he always followed, the one that made others bow their heads and walk away, had been torn up right in front of him. And Jason wasn't finished. "You think a badge makes you a protector?" Jason asked, his voice low, piercing. "No, the way you act when no one's watching. That's who you are. And right now, everyone's watching." Around them, the crowd had grown. At least a dozen more people stood nearby, many filming, some just watching in awe. The atmosphere had changed completely. Elijah, still seated on the bench, watched the exchange with eyes that had seen decades of injustice. And yet, in this moment, there was something different, something rare. A man standing in the fire on behalf of another. Not because he had to, because it was right. "I don't need a lecture from some washed-up movie star," Voss muttered, though even as he said it, the words felt hollow. Defensive. Weak. Jason's smile didn't fade. "You're right. You don't need a lecture. You need accountability." He turned to the crowd. "Is anyone here live streaming this?" A few hands went up immediately. Jason nodded. "Good. Keep it going. Not for me, for him." He motioned toward Elijah. "For every man who's been humiliated quietly while the world looked away." Voss took a step back, flustered. He touched the radio on his shoulder like a reflex, but hesitated. "Backup? No. It would only make things worse." There was no threat to report. Only a mirror being held up, and Voss didn't like what he saw. But it was Elijah who finally broke the silence. "I used to believe that education alone could fix this," he said, rising slowly from the bench. His voice was firm now, each syllable laced with history and pain. 42 years I stood in front of classrooms, believing the world could be better if we just taught people to think. But what I learned is that knowledge isn't enough. It takes courage. It takes voices. It takes people like him. He gestured to Jason, willing to stand when they don't have to. The crowd shifted again, this time closer. Several nodded. One woman wiped a tear from her eye. A man muttered under his breath, "It's about damn time." Voss looked overwhelmed, suddenly outnumbered not by bodies but by conscience. He adjusted his belt, turned toward Elijah. "You're free to go," he said, his voice quieter now. Elijah tilted his head. "I was never under arrest, officer." Jason stepped in again, not letting the moment pass just yet. "No apology?" he asked. "No recognition that maybe you crossed a line?" Voss hesitated, his jaw clenched. For a second, it looked like he might lash out again. But then, surprisingly, his eyes dropped to the ground. "I'm sorry," he said stiffly. "It wasn't heartfelt. It wasn't transformative. But it was the first crack in a wall that had stood unchallenged for far too long." Jason didn't smile. He simply nodded. "You don't have to be perfect. Just better." Then, turning back to Elijah, he extended a hand. Not in show, not for a camera, but in simple human respect. Elijah took it. The grip was firm, honest. "Would you walk with me a bit?" Jason asked. Elijah smiled faintly. With pleasure, they started down the path together, away from the crowd, past the curious glances and lifted phones. The sun was sinking now, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet. As they walked, Elijah spoke first. "You didn't have to do that, you know. Most people would have looked the other way." "I've seen too much to stay quiet anymore," Jason said. "I've played heroes on screen, sure. But if you're not willing to be one when it counts, then what's the point?" Elijah chuckled softly. "You're not like I expected." "Most people aren't," Jason replied. They walked in silence for a moment more. Birds chirped overhead. The sound of children playing returned in the distance, as if the park itself had exhaled. "You know," Elijah said, "there was a time when a man like me couldn't sit on that bench without risking his life. And there was a time when a man like you would have walked by without a second glance. We've come far, but days like today, they remind me how far we still have to go." Jason nodded, his eyes fixed ahead. "But you're still here, still standing. That means something." "You're right," Elijah said. "It means everything." They reached the edge of the park where an old drinking fountain stood, faded and rusted. Elijah paused to take a sip, then turned back to look at the bench, now empty under the shade of the oak tree. "Funny thing," he mused, "that tree's been here longer than either of us. It's seen the world change, seen pain, growth, struggle, and still it stands." Jason smiled. "Maybe we all need to be more like that tree." Elijah looked at him, then back at the path they'd walked. You changed something today. Not just for me. For everyone who saw it. Even for that officer. Jason looked uncertain. You think he'll change? Elijah shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. But now he knows someone's watching. And that's where change begins. They continued walking. Two men from very different worlds bound by a shared moment of defiance and hope. The park behind them began to thin out. Dusk crept in gently, painting long shadows over the grass. But just as they reached the exit, something else happened, something no one could have predicted. A second squad car pulled up. A different officer stepped out, older, grizzled, with a stern face and eyes that scanned the park like a hawk. On his chest, a badge gleamed under the fading light, and the moment his eyes locked on Jason and Elijah, he reached for his radio. Jason noticed immediately. His body tensed, not with fear but readiness. Elijah stopped too, sensing the tension return like a cold wind creeping up their backs. And that was the moment when both of them realized this wasn't over yet. The second officer was built like a block of stone, stocky, stern, with a buzz cut that hadn't changed in 30 years and a permanent scowl that looked carved into his face. His name tag read K. Marston, and he moved with the slow, calculated confidence of someone who believed the world owed him silence. The moment he stepped out of the cruiser, he placed one hand on his belt, the other on the radio clipped to his vest, and began muttering into it. Jason and Elijah exchanged a glance. Their peaceful walk now halted at the invisible barrier of suspicion and prejudice that had returned like a boomerang. Jason kept his tone calm. You see the look in his eye? Elijah nodded slowly. That's not someone coming to make peace. Officer Marston approached, eyes scanning the crowd that had mostly begun to disperse. Only a few people lingered now, still holding their phones, still whispering about what had just occurred. Marston looked toward the bench beneath the tree, then at the two men standing at the edge of the park, and immediately his demeanor hardened even more. You too, he barked, pointing directly at Jason and Elijah. Wait there. Jason didn't move. Elijah didn't either. But something subtle happened. Jason's body shifted slightly forward, the protective instinct kicking in as naturally as breathing. He wasn't a man seeking conflict, but he was absolutely a man prepared to face it if need be. What seems to be the problem, officer? Elijah asked, polite but firm, as if setting the tone. Marston didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took his time closing the distance, his boots thudding deliberately against the concrete path. I received a report of a civilian interfering with police duties, he said. We don't take that lightly. Jason raised an eyebrow. Interfering? Correct. There was a situation involving one of our officers earlier. A man matching your description decided to escalate it. I de-escalated it, Jason replied. Your officer was harassing an elderly man. I stepped in. That's called decency. Marston stepped closer, now just a few feet away. You obstructed a law enforcement officer in the performance of his duty. He was performing injustice. Elijah interjected. There's a difference. Marston's jaw tightened. Do either of you have any idea what it means to resist arrest? To interfere with authority? Because I can assure you, it carries consequences. Jason's eyes didn't waver. Do you have any idea what it means to carry a badge and use it like a weapon? That also carries consequences. And you're not the only one recording anymore. A bystander, an older Latina woman in a red scarf, raised her phone slightly higher. Another man, still filming, moved closer to the edge of the sidewalk. Elijah straightened his posture, the years of standing at the front of classrooms lending him the same authority now as they had then. He took a breath. Officer, he said, you are dangerously close to turning an already unjust moment into a much bigger disgrace. What happened here today will be talked about, watched, shared. The real question is, do you want to be part of the problem or part of the healing? Marston blinked. For the first time, his posture faltered. There was something about the stillness in Elijah's voice, the strength wrapped inside the gentleness, that made even this hardened man pause. I don't know what you think you saw, Marston muttered. I saw enough, Jason said. Enough to know your colleague was in the wrong. Enough to know you just walked up, ready to intimidate instead of investigate. but I'm going to offer you the same grace I offered him." Marston looked skeptical. "Grace?" "Yeah," Jason said. "That thing people forget about when they get too used to power." For a long moment, no one spoke. A single bird chirped in the distance. Then, surprisingly, Marston looked at Elijah and asked, "You're the one from the bench?" "Yes." "And you didn't do anything?" "I read a book," Elijah said. "In the same spot I've been reading it for years." Marston frowned. "You have ID?" Jason stepped forward. "No, we're done with that game." "You know who he is?" "He's a retired principal. A man who spent his life educating kids while you were probably still learning how to shine your boots." "You want ID? How about you show your integrity first?" Marston stared at Jason, and something flickered behind his eyes. Conflict. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, least of all by someone who wouldn't raise their voice or look away. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped back. His fingers unclenched from the radio. "I'll be filing a report," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "This is above my pay grade." Jason gave a short nod. "Make sure it's the truth this time." Marston lingered a moment more, then turned and walked back to his car. The door slammed shut, and within seconds, the engine started. The cruiser pulled away slowly, vanishing into the dusk like a predator slinking back into the shadows. Elijah let out a long breath. "I wasn't sure how that was going to end." "Neither was I," Jason admitted, "but I knew how it needed to end." The older man looked at him with newfound admiration. "You've got fire in you. Not the reckless kind. Something sharper." Jason smiled faintly. "Let's call it a refusal to be silent." They stood there for a while, neither in a rush to leave. The park had quieted again, its earlier tension slowly dissolving into the soft rustle of trees and the distant hum of traffic. A child's laughter rang out faintly across the grass, untouchable by the storm that had passed through just moments ago. Then, from behind them, a voice called out, "Mr. Owens?" Elijah turned. A young man, early 20s, clean-cut, wearing university hoodie, jogged up the path, clutching a small notebook in his hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the young man said, breathless. "I saw what happened. I've seen you here before. I'm studying education. I wanted to thank you." Elijah's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Thank me for not backing down, for being dignified, for proving that wisdom and patience are stronger than rage." Elijah looked touched. He extended his hand, and the young man shook it earnestly. Jason watched the exchange, silent but proud. "What's your name?" Elijah asked. "Marcus," the student replied. "Marcus Hill. I go to State. I'm going to be a teacher." Elijah's smile widened. "Then you've already won half the battle. Remember today, not for the pain, but for the power." Marcus nodded, his eyes shining. "I will." As the young man walked away, Jason looked at Elijah and said, "Looks like your classroom never really closed." Elijah chuckled. "No, I suppose it didn't." They began walking again, turning toward the street where Elijah had parked his old sedan. The night was beginning to set in now, stars poking through the curtain of twilight, the street lamps flickering on one by one. But neither man seemed tired. If anything, they walked lighter. You ever think about how many people go through something like that and don't get a witness? Jason asked quietly. "Every day," Elijah replied. "Every single day." "Well, not today." They stopped at the edge of the street, where Elijah's car sat, dusty but reliable. Jason glanced down the block and noticed a small cafe with a few late diners and the smell of strong coffee drifting into the air. "You got somewhere to be?" Jason asked. "Not particularly." "You hungry?" Elijah looked amused. "You asking me to dinner, Mr. Statham?" "I am," Jason said. "And I'll warn you, I'm buying." Elijah opened the car door and chuckled. "You drive a hard bargain." But just as they began walking toward the cafe, Elijah stopped and looked back one last time toward the park. Toward the bench, the oak tree, the history. "Funny," he said. "That old tree's seen men try to cut it down, carve it up, even burn it. But still there." Jason followed his gaze. "So are you." Elijah didn't reply. He didn't have to. But the moment they stepped into the cafe, everything shifted once more. Because seated in the back corner, hunched over a cup of coffee in an open folder, was a man in a suit with a badge pinned to his belt. He was watching the door, and he was waiting for them. The moment Jason's eyes met the man's, a quiet alarm rang in his instincts. It wasn't the kind of threat that came with fists or guns. It was more insidious. The man in the back booth wore a tailored gray suit, his hair slicked back with precision, a government-issued laptop open in front of him. He didn't flinch when Jason walked in. He didn't avert his gaze. He was waiting, no doubt about it. And the badge clipped to his belt? Federal, not local police. Something heavier. Jason subtly stepped in front of Elijah as they entered, his protective nature once again rising without thought. Elijah noticed and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, not to stop him, but to steady him. He'd seen enough in life to know when a conversation was about to shift from reality to something bigger, something systemic. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, greeted them warmly, but Jason barely registered it. He motioned toward an empty booth near the window, but before they could sit, the man in the back raised his hand with a small, practiced wave. Elijah Owens? Mr. Statham. His voice carried just enough authority to demand attention without raising its volume. Would you mind joining me for a moment? Jason's jaw tensed, but Elijah nodded calmly. Let's see what he wants. They crossed the cafe, the tiled floor squeaking slightly beneath their steps. Jason didn't sit until Elijah did. The man in the suit closed the folder slowly, his fingers deliberate, his eyes calculating. My name is Agent Whitmore, he said. I'm with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Elijah raised an eyebrow. That's a long way from a city park agent. Not really, Whitmore replied. I've been following Officer Voss's record for over a year now. Numerous complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, but no one could get a solid piece of evidence. Today, thanks to several bystanders and a few particularly useful videos, we may finally have what we need. Jason leaned forward. You knew he was a problem, and you let him keep patrolling the streets? Whitmore didn't flinch. That's not how it works. Internal affairs needs more than rumors. But now we've got leverage, and we've got public attention. Elijah narrowed his gaze. So why are we here? Because, Mr. Owens, Whitmore said, turning to face him more directly, you represent a story that this country desperately needs to hear right now. Not as a victim, but as a man of dignity, of resilience, who stood tall in the face of hate. And you, he added, nodding toward Jason. You used your platform not for fame, but for justice. That combination? It's rare. It's powerful. Jason's expression remained unreadable. You want to make a statement. Whitmore nodded. We do. But more than that, we want to file a formal civil rights case against Voss and potentially others in his department. We're looking into Marston as well. We'd like you both to testify. Elijah sat back slightly, weighing the words. You want me to relive this on a national stage? I want you to help us end it, Whitmore replied. For others who can't speak. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. Jason looked at Elijah, silently offering deference. This wasn't his call to make. This wasn't his story. It was Elijah's. I've been speaking all my life, Elijah said finally. Teaching, mentoring, protesting. You want me to tell this story again? Fine. But it won't be just about Voss. It'll be about the others too. The ones who watched and said nothing. The ones who walked past. The ones who enabled it. Whitmore nodded solemnly. Understood. That's exactly what we need. Jason sat up. You want me in? Whitmore hesitated. It's not required, but your testimony as a public figure could change the tone of the case. It'll draw more eyes, more pressure. Jason looked out the window at the quiet street beyond. If this helps make the world better for someone else's grandfather, someone else's daughter, I'm in. Whitmore smiled, not smugly, but with a genuine nod of respect. He passed them each a business card. I'll be in touch. We'll move carefully, deliberately. With that, he stood and left, the door chiming faintly as it closed behind him. Jason and Elijah remained seated for a moment longer, both staring at the cards in their hands like they weighed more than paper should. You ever think, Elijah said softly, how many times people like me have to ask permission just to exist peacefully in their own country? Jason looked at him, somber. Too many. And yet, Elijah added, smiling slightly, Today, for once, the story didn't end in silence. The waitress returned with 2 cups of coffee, placed them gently on the table, and walked away with a warm smile, unaware of the storm that had just passed. Jason wrapped his hands around the mug, the warmth grounding him. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Elijah asked. Jason gave a soft laugh. "No, but I've never needed to be ready. Just willing." They drank in silence for a few minutes. Around them, the cafe hummed with quiet life. Plates clinking, low conversation, a radio playing faint jazz in the background. But the peace they felt wasn't from the room. It was from within. Eventually, Elijah stood. "I should be heading home. My wife's going to ask why I'm late, and I'll have to explain how I got dragged into a civil rights case," by Jason Statham. Jason stood too, grinning. "Tell her I'm sorry, and that I owe her dinner. I'll tell her you're good company." They walked outside, the night cool but gentle. Jason walked Elijah to his car, then paused. "Do you think it'll matter?" Jason asked, quieter now. "What we did today?" Elijah opened his car door and looked back. "It already does." He got in and drove off, taillights fading into the night. Jason watched the car disappear, then turned and walked slowly back down the sidewalk. Each step felt heavier, not with burden, but with purpose. But he didn't know that as he reached the end of the block, someone was watching him from a nearby alley. A young man, barely 20, leaning against a wall, hoodie up, eyes hard. He'd been at the park earlier. Jason hadn't seen him. He stepped into the light now. "Hey," he called out. Jason turned, alert but calm. "Can I help you?" The kid hesitated, then said, "Why'd you do it? Stepping for that old guy? You didn't even know him." Jason studied him for a moment, then said, "Because that's what men are supposed to do, especially when nobody else will." The young man nodded, eyes thoughtful. "My brother got arrested last year. For nothing. They beat him. I didn't do anything." "You still can," Jason said. "How? Start with today?" Jason replied. "Do something good, something different." The young man seemed to consider that. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Jason stood still for a moment longer, then exhaled. The world was still broken, still burning in places. But tonight, in one corner of it, something had changed. And by morning, the world would know. Because the video from the park? It was already going viral. By dawn, the world had seen it. The video captured under the old oak tree. Officer Voss standing over Elijah with the posture of a predator, Jason stepping between them like a force of nature. The conversation that turned into a reckoning had gone viral in a way that transcended the typical news cycle. It was everywhere, not just on social media, but on morning television, major news outlets, international media. The hashtags were trending. Hashtag Dignity in the Park, hashtag Statham stands, hashtag Elijah Owens, and even hashtag Voss Exposed. People weren't just watching, they were talking, arguing, reflecting, sharing stories of their own. In Chicago, a middle school teacher paused her lesson plan and showed the video to her class. In London, a journalist dedicated an entire editorial to the encounter, calling it a quiet revolution in a public space. In South Africa, a retired activist tweeted, "That man, Elijah, is what we fought for." Jason Statham reminded us we still have work to do. The reach was global, the reaction seismic. But perhaps nowhere was the impact more personal than in the small apartment of Elijah Owens, where the man himself sat in his modest kitchen, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. His wife Sharon seated across the table with her reading glasses on and a printout of the morning paper in her hands. On the front page, a still frame, Jason, standing firm. Elijah, seated but proud. The officer, scowling above them. "You made the front page," Sharon said with a half smile. Elijah grinned. "Not how I imagined retirement." She looked over the glasses. "You think you're done?" "They're calling nonstop. CNN, MSNBC. Even Trevor Noah's team left a message." "I'm not interested in being famous," he said. "No," she replied, "but you're needed." He looked out the window. The morning light warmed the sill, and outside, a pair of kids passed by on scooters, their laughter echoing down the block. It reminded him of the kids he used to teach, how he used to believe that one voice in one classroom could ripple out into the world. Maybe it still could. His phone buzzed. A message from Jason. Today's going to be loud. Hope you're ready. Jay. Elijah chuckled. He was. Meanwhile, across the city, Jason Statham sat in the back of a black SUV, dressed in a dark suit, hair slicked back. Not for a film set, but for something real. The Department of Justice had fast-tracked the investigation. The pressure was too great. With the world watching, every move mattered. Jason had been invited to speak at a press conference with Elijah, representatives from the DOJ, and several community leaders. It wasn't a role he had trained for, but it was one he stepped into like a man who finally understood what his strength was meant for. He stared out the window as the city passed by in a blur. Graffiti, commuters, coffee shops opening for business. 1,000 lives unfolding. And he thought about something Elijah had said to him the night before. Justice isn't loud, Elijah had murmured. It's steady. It's a river, not a storm. The SUV pulled up to the courthouse steps. There were reporters everywhere, camera crews scrambling for angles, microphones being clipped to jackets. Jason stepped out to a frenzy of flashing lights and shouted questions, but he didn't flinch. He spotted Elijah already waiting at the top of the stairs, dressed in a crisp blazer, tie knotted perfectly, dignity radiating off him like sunlight. They greeted each other with a firm handshake, then climbed the final steps together. And behind them, the crowd quieted. For the first time in hours, there was silence. Then Elijah stepped forward to the podium. My name is Elijah Owens, he began, his voice clear and calm despite the nerves flickering behind his eyes. I am a citizen, a teacher, a husband, a grandfather. Last week, I was harassed in a public park for doing what every human being has a right to do, exist in peace. But I'm not here today as a victim. I'm here as a witness. To injustice, yes, but also to courage. He gestured gently to Jason, who stood off to the side, head bowed slightly in humility. This man didn't know me. He had nothing to gain by standing up for me, but he did. And in doing so, he reminded the world that silence is never the answer. That power used in defense of the vulnerable is the only kind that matters. Jason stepped up next, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He looked out over the sea of faces, some angry, some hopeful, many just searching for something real. I've made a career out of fighting bad guys on screen, he said finally. But what I saw in that park wasn't a movie. It was real. A man who'd done nothing wrong was treated like a threat because of the color of his skin. That doesn't sit right with me. It shouldn't sit right with any of us. He took a breath. We talk a lot about heroes in this country, but I think we've been looking in the wrong places. Because real heroes don't wear capes. They wear khakis and sweaters. They sit on benches and read books. And they carry the weight of generations on their shoulders. He turned to Elijah, voice softening. Thank you for letting me be a part of your moment. The applause that followed was thunderous. Reporters fired questions, cameras rolled. Microphones reached out like eager hands. But for Jason and Elijah, the noise faded. What mattered was already said. Over the following weeks, the case against Officer Voss moved forward with unprecedented speed. Video evidence, community testimonies, and years of ignored complaints were laid bare. The department came under review. Policies were revised. Trainings were mandated. Marston resigned before an internal inquiry could begin. But more than legal victories, something deeper shifted. Across the country, people began recording not just injustices, but kindness. In parks, people started stepping in when they saw something wrong. In schools, students wrote essays about Elijah Owens. In communities, new coalitions were formed, groups of young people inspired not by celebrity, but by integrity. And a young man from the alley, the one who'd watched Jason from the shadows, he applied to join a local community outreach program. A month later, he stood in front of a classroom at a youth center telling kids, "You don't have to be strong to fight. You just have to be brave." As for Jason, he continued making movies, but something had shifted in him. At premieres, he started using his platform to talk about justice. At interviews, he referenced Elijah by name. "He's the real deal," Jason would say. "He taught me more in an hour than most scripts ever could." And Elijah? He kept walking to the park every Thursday. Same bench, same book. But now, people stopped to shake his hand. Kids sat beside him and asked questions. Young men approached him with stories of their own struggles. He listened, every time, because that was the kind of hero he was. One afternoon, Jason joined him again, coffee in hand, both men seated under the oak tree as birds chirped overhead. "You think the world's really changing?" Jason asked. Elijah looked up at the sky, clouds drifting slowly past. "I think it already has," he said. "The question is, will we keep pushing?" Jason smiled. "We will." And they sat there, two men, two stories, one moment that had rippled across the globe. Not because of fame or force, but because in the face of injustice, they chose to stand together.